He's around 190, 200 pounds and 6 feet tall, so a very large guy, and he's in this space only 18 inches wide.
On November 24, 2009, 26-year-old medical student John Edward Jones was visiting his family in Utah for Thanksgiving. He was joined by his pregnant wife Emily and their 13-month-old daughter Lizzie. As part of their celebration, John's family, including his brother Josh and a couple other friends, decided to visit Nutty Putty Cave, a popular caving spot just outside Salt Lake City. What started as an exciting family adventure on Thanksgiving would quickly turn into a life-or-death struggle. As John, Josh, and their friends made their way into Nutty Putty Cave, they had no idea of the terrifying danger that awaited them 400 feet beneath the surface, an ordeal that would ultimately lead to the cave being sealed with concrete forever. This is the story of how a series of seemingly small decisions led to an unimaginable tragedy. Nutty Putty Cave, first explored in the 1960s, is a wild limestone cave located in Utah, about 55 miles south of Salt Lake City. Over the decades, Nutty Putty Cave, once considered beginner-friendly, gained fame for its complex narrow tunnels that made crawling extremely difficult as the sticky walls cling to clothes and equipment. The number of visitors skyrocketed from 5,000 to 25,000 in just 2 years. But with that increase came a higher risk of accidents. By 2006, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. A series of high-profile rescues had emergency officials deeply concerned. Perhaps most alarming was a 2004 incident involving a teenager who became trapped in one of the many cave's narrow passages. A harrowing rescue that lasted 14 agonizing hours before he was barely saved. The mounting evidence of danger prompted officials to close Nutty Putty Cave in May 2006, sealing its entrance and leaving it inaccessible. However, this decision sparked immediate controversy as caving enthusiasts launched a passionate campaign to reopen the cave, arguing that responsible explorers shouldn't be punished for others' mistakes. They insisted that with proper precautions, the cave could be enjoyed safely. The argument continued for 3 years while the cave remained sealed, but then in March 2009, a compromise was made. A compromise that would have fatal consequences. Nutty Putty Cave reopened under a new management plan that introduced a permit system requiring advanced application and including 2 critical rules. Applicants had to apply 21 days ahead and include at least 2 experienced cavers. Well, this last requirement, seemingly straightforward, contained a fatal flaw. On the evening of November 24th, at around 7 p.m., John and his brother Josh, accompanied by their friends, arrived at Nutty Putty Cave ready to begin their adventure. John and Josh being the 2 experienced cavers required for the visit, they approached the cave with confidence, having spent much of their childhood exploring caves. In fact, as a child, John even played the role of a trapped victim for the Utah Cave Rescue Team, led by his father. But the truth is, they hadn't been caving for a long time, raising the question, were they really experienced cavers? The critical distinction between casual past experience and current technical competence was never properly addressed by the permit requirements. This was an oversight that would contribute directly to what's about to happen to John. John and Josh had a straightforward plan for their adventure. Enter the cave, navigate through the big slide, pass through the narrow passage called the birth canal, take a break in the small opening called the lake room before turning around and heading back out. The group had to carefully plan every movement due to the cave's extremely tight pathways, some of them being 12 to 18 inches wide. But the tighter the space, the more excited John became. He was looking forward to the cave's most notorious challenge, the birth canal, where he would have to go in headfirst, squeezing his body through the narrow passage to reach the opening. Well, everything was going according to plan, until John arrived at the narrow tunnel, a tunnel that he believed to be the birth canal. In that moment, he repositioned himself, took a deep breath, and started to wiggle himself through. But the more he pushed, the tighter it got, until he could no longer lift his head. By this point, John is getting rushes of adrenaline and excitement, so he kept pushing, believing the opening is close. But John had made a critical mistake. Instead of the birth canal, he entered what was actually an unmapped section of the cave system, the treacherous corkscrew. The corkscrew passage was fundamentally different from the birth canal, narrowing dramatically after entry to dimensions barely wider than a standard kitchen cabinet, just 10 inches at its narrowest points. For John's 6-foot, 200-pound frame, this created a serious mismatch. The passage required increasingly difficult body contortions as it twisted downward, with sharp limestone turns creating a journey that became progressively impossible to reverse. With each inch he crawled forward, the tunnel pressed tighter around his body. It was getting harder to breathe, harder to move, to the point he had to make a choice: keep going hoping the tunnel would open up, or start the painful task of going back the way he just came from. But the belief that he was navigating a known, mapped section likely reinforced John's determination to continue despite the warning signs. On top of that, his previous caving experiences may have created a false sense of security that turned into hope, as each step seemed to promise John much-needed relief. The critical moment arrived when John spotted an apparent widening in the passage, an opening that seemed to offer the space needed to finally turn around. He was excited. He believed this had to be the entrance to the lake room, but to pass through, he had to compress his chest by a deep exhale. And he did just that. He deeply exhaled and quickly moved through the opening, but as he squeezed through, he entered headfirst into the suffocating, claustrophobic, upside-down trap. It was a dead end. His chest expanded as he breathed again, wedging his arms and ribcage firmly against the limestone in a space measuring only 10 by 18 inches. Panic set in for John as he struggled to free himself, realizing he was trapped upside down in an extremely dangerous position. And with that realization came the crushing truth. He knew exactly where he had made a critical mistake. He tried to calm down and managed to reach his walkie-talkie, after which he communicated to his brother about what happened. Upon hearing the message, Josh left one of their friends behind to stay with John while he rushed to get help. But with every passing minute, John's physical condition deteriorated as his body fought against its unnatural confinement. His inverted position forced blood to his head and placed immense pressure on his organs. As the hours dragged on, it wasn't until 12:30 a.m., over 3 hours later, that the first rescuer, Susie, arrived at the scene, finding John trapped and conscious, but desperate for help. When Susie introduced herself, John mustered a weak smile of relief. "Hi, Susie," he said. "It's nice to meet you, but I really want to get out of here." She did everything she could to free him, even cutting away part of his pants to create more space to pull him out. But despite her best efforts, after 2 hours of relentless struggle, Susie knew she couldn't free John alone. The task was too immense, so she went to get backup, aware that time was running out. By this point, over 130 rescuers had arrived at the location of the cave, and Susie gave the report about John's location and condition. Among them were engineers and cave rescue experts, who, after talking through about every possible solution, came up with a solid plan of rescuing John. The plan involved creating a pulley system to lift him from trapped position, but due to the cave's tight space, only one rescuer could enter at a time, bringing in a single piece of equipment. This made the operation even more challenging for the team, but especially for John, who was trapped in an upside-down position, far beyond the limits the human body can endure. His body already began to shut down. Gravity made it harder for his heart to pump blood, increasing pressure on his brain and eyes. His diaphragm was compressed, making it extremely difficult to breathe. Blood pooled in his legs, causing numbness, and his blood pressure dropped, putting his body under extreme stress. It was clear he was starting to suffocate, which pushed the team to work even harder on setting up the first pulley system. And after everything was set up, the rescue team encountered a huge obstacle. John was wedged so tightly in the narrow passage that rescuers could only strap ropes around his ankles, and pulling him out this way risked serious injury, potentially even breaking his legs. But that was the only way. Surprisingly, the team managed to lift John slightly to administer an IV. However, a bolt holding the pulley system came loose, sending him crashing even deeper into the shaft. This setback wasted hours of precious time. John started to struggle mentally. He was losing hope, doubting that he will make it out. At that critical moment, through the radio, his worried wife, who was at the scene, spoke words of comfort to John. Her voice was filled with hope, saying, "I know you've been pushing for so long, John. Why don't you rest for a moment? Take a break, and then try again." She didn't only encourage John, but everyone else at the scene. So, despite the setback, the team pushed forward. They installed a new system of ropes and pulleys and drilled the cave walls to widen the space around John. And after they pulled him up for the third time, they managed to lift him high enough for a rescuer to make eye contact. The rescuer reported that John's face was covered in mud, his eyes were red, and he was clearly struggling to breathe. Yet John's hope didn't fade. Just as they prepared for the fourth pull, another disaster struck. A bolt drilled into the cave wall came loose again, but this time causing part of the cave to collapse. The falling debris hit the lead rescuer in the head, causing him to black out. Worst of all, John slipped back into his original position, this time unconscious. Any remaining hope shattered as it became clear that the system had failed again. Reality was setting in for everyone. Time had ran out. John was unconscious. The cave was silent, except for the sound of settling dust. After 27 agonizing hours spent trapped, waiting and struggling, John Edward Jones was pronounced dead at 11:56 a.m. on November 25, 2009. Rescuers thought about trying to get his body out, but given the tough spot he was in, they eventually decided to leave the cave as his final resting place. On November 30th, 2009, the government made the call to seal the cave off, making sure no more tragedies would happen there. What makes this tragedy especially heartbreaking is the devastating truth that a series of seemingly ordinary small decisions, each one insignificant on its own, ultimately converged to create a disaster no one could have foreseen. Entering the cave that evening, choosing the wrong passage, and exploring the fissure alone weren't fatal on their own. It was their compounding effect, each eliminating previous options for retreat, that ultimately trapped John 400 feet below the surface in a position from which rescue would prove impossible. The tragedy of John's death is felt most deeply by those he left behind. His wife, pregnant with their second child, and their daughter Lizzie now live with the sorrow of his absence.